So welcome to the assurance webinar. This is in particular is the work that the ARC project has done to extend the REFEDS Assurance Framework specification. Just very briefly to remind you that the IAM Online webinar was initiated in the US by Internet2 and EduCause with the idea to promote identity and access management topics. And they started on their own. At some point, we thought that we could have our European counterpart, and now we have a joint YouTube channel where there are webinars from both sides, so you may find also other useful information there. I think I've done talking, so Davide, Uros, the floor is yours. I think it would be nice if people can see your faces also.
Okay, thanks a lot, Licia. This is, hello everyone, this is Davide Baghetti from GAR, and along with Uros Stefanovic from KIT, I've been a participant to the Authentication and Authorization for Research Collaboration project, or ARC in short. I've been involved in the JRA1, that is the Joint Research Activity. And today, me and Uros, we will speak about the ARC extensions to the REFEDS Assurance Framework. So first of all, probably it would be interesting to understand why ARC bothered to try to extend the REFEDS Assurance Framework, which at that time, when we started working on it, wasn't even finished. And wasn't a standard, at least, it was just a draft. So the REFEDS Assurance Framework was explained in a previous webinar. So I will concentrate on why ARC developed an additional guidances. So the basic target was to facilitate the exchange of assurance information across research infrastructures, or if you want, between SP-IdP-Proxies, which are one of the main component of the ARC blueprint architecture. And this ended up in creating supplementary ARC and IGTF assurance profiles targeting the specific needs of research infrastructures in terms of risk profiles. And the target is to obviously share this assurance profile and exchange them directly, and also help evaluate identity assurance information for the attributes and the authenticator presented both by the users, home organizations, coming from research and identity federations, and from supplementary sources. So I will now tell you briefly today's agenda. So there will be a short introduction to the REFEDS Assurance Framework from Uros. Then the ArcGeo 21 guideline on the exchange of specific assurance information between infrastructure will be presented. Then will be the time for ArcGeo 41, which is about how to express assurance components for identities coming from the so-called social media accounts. And finally, how we can put all this together and give some guidance for the evaluation and combination of all this different assurance information. And we will also briefly speak on how compensatory controls for the lack of assurance information can be implemented. I will leave now the floor to Uros Stefanovic, and I'll speak with you later. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, David, for the introduction. So I will just start with a short overview about what actually REFEDS has done and where this work was conducted. And all this work was done within the REFEDS Assurance Working group, and the output was it was 2 likes, so in two parts for the REFEDS Assurance Framework. That work was dealing with the trustworthiness of the underlying assertion, right? So that means how well can we trust the information contained in whether it's attributes or OpenID Connect, it doesn't really matter. So the people who were involved with that before should be aware that the authentication profiles were essentially put in another work, so that the multi-factor authentication, single-factor authentication is not really participating within the REFEDS Assurance Framework. And we will mention them, of course, because they do relate to certain profiles, but they're not really included per se in the REFEDS Assurance Framework itself. Now, the REFEDS Assurance Framework, or RAF, it contains the following main components. So it talks about the assurance, the conformance criteria, it mentions the profiles, and it gives suggestions how that should be expressed in SAML and OpenID Connect. The insurance components talk about the ID uniqueness, what is the proofing, and what kind of attribute quality we can expect from it. And these will be the main parts that I will try to essentially just recap now. So the uniqueness component needs to have 4 properties in order to be true. So it needs to relate to a natural person, that person must be able to be contacted by the CSP or the credential service provider. The identifier itself must never be reassigned, and it just mentions certain SAML or OpenID Connect attributes that correspond to this value. It's expressed as prefix ID unique, where the prefix essentially goes back to REFEDS. The EPPN itself can be used. However, the actual specification of EPPN is undefined. The quality of it and how can you assess the EPPN is undefined by the specification. Therefore, if you want to use EPPN, you can only use it in conjunction with one of the following, only one. You cannot use EPPN unique, no reassign, and reassign 1 year together. So it's either one or the other, and it must be used with one in order to consider EPPN as of proper quality for unique identifier. For identity proofing and credential management, the REFEDS Assurance Framework envision 3 parameters. They can be low, medium, and high. For people coming from grid, they already may be familiar, especially with low and medium, because low corresponds to dogwood and medium would correspond to birch or cedar. One other thing, though, to consider here is that this is not only about identity proofing, this is also about the credential management itself. So that means how secure the credential is, how you issue it, and so on. So you need to comply with all these requirements in order to assert one of these values. So what are the procedures for this, for example? When it comes to, let's say, identity proofing part, well, the low could be a self-asserted identity with a verified email. So if you are verified that the email belongs to a person, that's low. The medium, one example could be in-person vetting with a government-issued ID. This is not the only way, of course, but it's one-off. It's commonly done in grid community. And the high is, for example, could be the in-person vetting with a government-issued ID, but there needs to be a record check, right? Now, the more of this you can find in the REFEDS Assurance Framework or in the presented information like Cantata or ADAS. So when we talk about the attribute quality and freshness, in REFEDS Assurance Framework, we only deal with edu-person affiliation, edu-person scoped affiliation, and edu-person primary affiliation. And it is only limited to the faculty, student, and member values, because everything else is undefined or their meaning is undefined. Therefore, you can only use these 2 values in conjunction with these attributes. And they are 1 month. So it's essentially that at the moment of assertion, it reflects user's departure within 31 days time, or in the case of 1 day, within 1 day. So essentially that means at the moment of assurance, of the moment of issuing such assertion, the IDP is only guaranteed that in the last 30 days, that more than last 30 days ago, the user was definitely still there. But within the last 31 days, he may or may not. But that is what the attribute, for 1 day, it's 1 day. So all this work from REFEDS was taken over by AARC. It was actually participated by AARC, but we soon realized that when it comes to proxies and inter-proxy communication or proxy to SP communication, focus on, let's say, actual component values, which is the focus of REFEDS Assurance Framework, might be too complicated for service providers. Therefore, the idea of this work was to introduce additional profiles that may help service providers how to actually evaluate this information. So naturally, this deals only with the exchange of information between infrastructure proxies or between the information between the SPs and the proxies themselves. It is not to be used for exchange of information, for example, between identity providers or service providers, because that is supposed to be reliant on the REFEDS Assurance Framework itself. Now, naturally, one thing I want to say, this document is final when it comes to AARC, but it will be updated with new information or fixes. But the DOI will always stay the same, so that people can always find it. So anyway, the additional profiles that AARC Geo21 comes into play were adopting 2 additional profiles from the grid communities and defining one own AARC ASAM, which essentially deals with the identities coming from the social media or from identity providers outside of research and education communities. So what are these profiles? Well, Cappuccino, as I mentioned before, it relies on REFEDS, and it is defined by REFEDS itself. And if you want to use this profile, that means that the proxy itself must assert all these following attributes. I just want to say that, and must comply with each relevant provision of this attribute. So if they assert medium, that means that the action, it's either medium which is received from the IDP itself, or the proxy itself has procedures in place that they can ensure that the medium is respected. Also, the attribute for 1 month, the attribute freshness 1 month should only be asserted if it's asserted by the source of information, because if it's not, then even if you are aware that this is probably compliant with the attribute, with the identity provider from which you receive this information, you should not receive it unless you should not assert it unless you receive it. Now, Espresso is the same or similar to Cappuccino. However, it introduces the identity vetting high and credential management high. And again, that really means that all of these procedures need to be followed. Well, for Birch, the situation is slightly different. The only must is that you must assert that it is a Birch profile. Everything else is a should. So that means that you don't have to assert this once you communicate between the proxies or from the proxy to the service provider itself. However, you should assert these values if you receive them, or that you are sure that internal processes that exist within the proxy or some other business logic is applied, that you can actually be sure that these values and these procedure for this are followed. As you can see, the Birch potentially envisions SFA compliance as well, and also MFA, the multi-factor authentication. However, the full IGTF Birch MFA is not really compliant with REFEDS MFA, because REFEDS MFA is saying that the second factor must be wholly independent of the first factor, which is not really the case for IGTF Birch. So therefore, you can only assert MFA if you are following REFEDS MFA, because that is the reference authority for this value. Same goes for Dogwood. The only must is a Dogwood, and everything else is a should. And of course, you should only assert them either if you receive this information or you are really sure, you're really certain that you can assert these values downstream. Now, ASAM. ASAM is a new profile introduced by AARC in order to cover the social media situation, because most of the proxy now support social media and everybody has them. So the idea was, how can we use them within the research communities, or having some kind of business IDPs or something like that. Again, the only must here is awesome, and there are really no guarantees for anything else. And you can, again, assert unique or low, but only if you are certain that you have procedures in place that you can ensure this. Because as we know, a lot of these social media recycle their accounts, and essentially you need to be sure that you can catch these problems, these situations, when you operate with them. Which brings us back to ARC-GEO 41 on way to deal with all these, how to deal with the situation created by using social media accounts. And the problem here is that not all of the social media or email providers are the same. The problem here comes to that, for example, Google does not reassign, or essentially you can kind of make sure that Google does not reassign their identities. But for Facebook, it is a known problem that they, for example, have a lot of fake accounts. So how could you assert unique unless you're certain that this person is real? Well, there are several ways to do this. And one way that documented vision is, well, if you already join and you verify this contact and the person has actually conducted certain actions within the proxy, you're reasonably certain that this is a natural person. It is not yet clear that bots are able to do this. As and if that situation happens, we may need to revise this document. And also, and additionally, you should introduce the acceptable use policy that this person needs to accept, with all the proper requirements. And these requirements usually include that you must be a natural person, that you cannot have fake accounts, that you cannot share your account actually, and it's only related to you. So if you introduce these couple of logics, and you may have additional logic if you want this kind of additional vetting, you could kind of make sure that this is a natural person, and with coming from a proper social media account that do follow the unique requirements, you can kind of even go for unique. So, and you can ensure that all these 4 parameters which are necessary to assert unique are actually followed. So what are the actual recommendations of this paper is that if your ID is solely based on a social media and you don't do anything within the proxy, you can only assert awesome and nothing else. And therefore, with that, you can signal your SPs that actually you're not really sure the quality of this, or that you're actually pretty certain that quality of this identity is pretty low. On the other side, if you introduce certain logic like AUP, you can actually put unique. And if you are actually certain that this person has a valid email address that you can contact them to, and they responded and they verified this email address, you can actually, in addition to that, assert also low. And how this also work and the actual example of this, Davide will now present in his work.
So, as Uro said, the ARC-GEO 31 is a guideline for the evaluation and combination of the assurance of external identities, but is also an interpretation of the all the rules that has been defined in the ARC-GEO 41 for compensate for the lack of assurance information for example, for the social media accounts, but also for EduGain, for example, for, say, identity federation, identity providers that are not communicating any assurance information. So let's go back for 1 second to the ARC blueprint architecture. A research infrastructure that follows the ARC blueprint architecture will set up an authentication and authorization infrastructure based on a central IDP-SP-Proxy that will act as a gateway for its own services and resources. Infrastructures, AIs, usually rely on existing external identity providers, as can be seen here in the user identity box. And in order to identify and authenticate their users, the infrastructures also need to define 1 or more assurance profiles tailored to a specific risk assessment Think, for example, as an infrastructure dedicated to give access to human genomic data sets. In that case, it would be very important and urgent to specify what are the needed assurance profiles. So in order to assign an assurance profile to a user, the infrastructure will evaluate the assurance components of the external identity or identities used to register to the infrastructure's AAI. And in the ARCGO 31 guidelines, we provide a method on how to combine those assurance information and compensate for the lack of it. So in this context, it is assumed that a user has one or more identities provided by an external identity provider. And for external, we mean external to and independent of the infrastructure. Being it the home organization, IDP, a social media account, or a community managed VO. These external identities provide both identity information, such as profile attributes, affiliation and assurance information, and also authentication. And when a user links multiple external identities to an infrastructure, it is important to distinguish the one that is used to authenticate, and we call it the effective identity. We'll see later why. The infrastructure will also assign another identity to the user, a so-called infrastructure identity that will be used within the infrastructure itself to access local services and resources. This infrastructure identity can be associated with a set of credentials issued by the infrastructure itself, but more often the authentication part is carried on by the external identity, as we have seen. So, but how can we combine different assurance information into the so-called infrastructure identity? As we already seen, the REFEDS Assurance Framework splits the assurance into three separate orthogonal components: the ID1, the IAP1, and the ATP1. The combination of values of these components result in different assurance profiles, which can be eventually tailored to specific requirements. So in order to combine assurance components values in a way that makes it possible to implement that logic in an algorithm, we defined the following rules. So here we're speaking about assurance information coming from multiple identities. For the ID component, the value for the infrastructure identity should be calculated with an AND operation, where a value unique is equal to true and the not available value is treated as a false. The outcome of the combined evaluation will make it impossible to assert the value unique for the infrastructure identity when one of the linked identities lacks it. And this is done with the purpose to prevent the whitewashing of shared and reassignable accounts through the combination with properly ID unique value accounts. So talking now about the IAP component, which is the one more tightly related to the identity vetting and proofing procedures. So we consider that the combination of different values for the IAP component is really not possible because because of the nature of this component, which is also not limited to the identity proofing embedding, which by itself is sensible enough, but also because it is related to the credential management. So things like the rules for the reissuing of the credentials, the renewal or the reset of the credentials are also part of the value of this component. So in this case, the value for the infrastructure identity will be equivalent to the value of the effective identity, which is the identity used to authenticate to the infrastructure. Finally, in the case of the ATP component, which is the one about the attribute quality and freshness, in this case, it really makes no sense at all to use that value to define the ATP component for the infrastructure identity itself. Currently, the ATP component is used only for the affiliation to express, as we have seen, to express the freshness and quality of the affiliation value, and specifically to reflect the user's departure within a fixed period of time. Thus, in this case, the ATP value must be relative to the infrastructure itself. So, this was about the combination of values. But as many of us know, currently the adoption rate of the REFEDS Assurance Framework among research infrastructures and identity federation is quite low. The adoption just started. At the same time, many identity federations do not really have independent assurance profiles on which we can base the assurance evaluation, if they could be compared to the defined RAF components. So when no assurance information is directly provided by the IDP during the authentication, the infrastructure should not make any assumption on the assurance of the external identities, but it should rely on other evidences and compensatory controls to ascertain the relevant assurance features of the incoming identity. So the compensatory controls we envisioned are entirely based on the ARC-GEO 21, which is the guideline on the exchange of specific assurance information between infrastructure, and ARC-GEO 41, which is the expression of REFEDS RAF assurance components for identities derived from social media accounts. So in the case of the ID component, we evaluated the requirements for the value unique. And as we already know, these requirements are that the user must be a single network person, that the IDP can contact the person, and that the identifier itself is one of the well-known identifiers that guarantees uniqueness and persistency and the likes. So to match the single network person requirement, we defined a compensatory control which is based on an AUP, and we called it I'm a person. To match the CSP can contact the person requirement, we created another compensatory control, and we called it contacts. And both of them can also be substituted by the REFEDS research and scholarship entity category support by the IDP. Because in the very definition of the research and education research and scholarship, sorry, entity category, we have both that the user must be communicated with an identifier that identify itself a single natural person, and also, sorry, and also we have all the attributes that we need to contact back the user. As for the identifier, that part can be evaluated technically by the SP side of the infrastructure, just looking at the released identifier. So in the case of the IAP component and the requirements for value low, the case that we consider is the one where we have self-asserted identity, a self-asserted identity with a verified email, which is basically the baseline that is in common with all the three profiles cited by assurance profiles cited by the REFEDS Assurance Framework for the value low of the IAP component, which are the Kantara Assurance Level 1, IGTF Level Dogwood, and IGTF Level Aspect. So the compensatory control in this case is a verified email. We'll see just now what we really mean by verified in this context. So going a little deeply inside this compensatory control, let's start with the I'm a person one. So a user registering to the infrastructure will be required to confirm that he or she is a single natural person, and he or she will not share the account with other people. Those requirements may also be included well, should be included to implement this compensatory control in the infrastructure AUP. So obviously, the acceptance of this AUP or the terms of service or the terms of use of the infrastructure will not guarantee you that the user is really a single natural person, but it will give you a solid ground for banning or suspending malevolent or misbehaving users, and so it will be very, very useful to actually employ it. So in the case of the contacts compensatory control, the external identity providers used by the users registering to the infrastructure will be required to release contacts information as email or mobile phone number. And it must be noted that the confirmation email compensatory control can obviously substitute the contacts one, but not vice versa. So, as I said before, the research and scholarship entity category can act as a substitute for both the I'm a person and the contacts compensatory controls. And the reason is that when an IDP asserts that it supports the REFEDS research and scholarship entity category, it commits to release a set of attributes following specific rules on the quality of the identifier, which guarantee the uniqueness, for example. And also, it commits to release contacts information on the user. finally, the conf email compensatory control. So when a user wants to register to a service, it is common practice to send an email to the provided address with a confirmation link. And once received, the user will follow the link to complete the registration process. This very same process can be embraced by the infrastructure for the user registration. And the final result will be that we have the verified email, which is prescribed as one of the requirements for the IAP value allow. It must be noted that in this context, the infrastructure should really embrace the active process that has just been described. And so it cannot, this information, I mean, the fact that the email is a confirmed email or a verified email cannot be extracted or deduced by other attributes or conveyed with claims such as the OpenID Connect email verified one, because obviously they are just claims in this context coming from the IDP. So many of these compensatory controls may appear, and they probably are a little bit, may appear a little bit naive to many of you. But we did this exercise to let you actually implement them with a very simple Boolean logic. So basically, as I said in the beginning, the purpose was to let you define an algorithm and implement it in an automated fashion. So this flowchart explains you how you actually do the evaluation of an external identity. So when you are receiving the identity from the external identity provider, the evaluation can start. And first of all, the evaluation for the two components, the ID1 and the AP1, can be run in parallel because they are not dependent. So on the left, you can see the evaluation on the ID component. And first of all, you have to ask yourself if there is an ID component in the person assurance attribute, and if the value is unique or not. In the case it is not, you should first of all evaluate if the IDP is supporting the research and scholarship entity category. And once again, if not, then you can run the compensatory controls defined for the value unique of the ID component. In the case of the AAP one, once again, you evaluate the person assurance attribute, and in case you don't have a match, you can apply the conf email compensatory control. And this is how the evaluation ends. Let me go further. So where these compensatory controls should be implemented, as it is written in the GO31 guideline, all these compensatory controls should be implemented in the registration platform of the infrastructure. And this is basically because many of these controls, like, for example, the I'm a person one or the conf email one, need some kind of interaction with the user, so they cannot be run in real time. Usually, the authentication process needs to stop at some point, and it can be recovered from that point once that the user interacted with the controls. So many research and research infrastructures are using a very well-known platform, VO platform, for the management of the registration to the infrastructure, which is the Internet to co-manage web application. So in co-manage, it is really simple to implement some of the compensatory controls that we defined in the specification. So the I'm a person one, as we have seen, is based on the acceptance of an AUP by the user. And co-manage does support the creation of terms and conditions, which obviously can be used as an AUP. Co-manage lets you define your own terms and conditions, and with obviously all the needed text or reference and external URL. And then it will let you link these terms and conditions, or this AUP, to a specific enrollment flow in the collaboration, and which basically means that if the user will not accept the AUP, he or she cannot enroll in the collaboration itself. As for the confirmation email compensatory control, once again, the co-manage will let you configure an enrollment flow with the request of an email confirmation by the user, which will obviously let you verify that the user is in control of the email the identity provider actually released along with other user information, and thus apply this compensatory control. So this work is still a work in progress. There are infrastructures, research infrastructures, on which these compensatory controls and these guidelines on how to combine assurance information or evaluate other evidences for compensating for the lack of them are currently implementing some of these rules. And the best way to follow up on this work is to join the AppInt mailing list, which, even though the ARC project finished, is still active, and where some of the people that participated to, and some of the research infrastructure that participated to ARC and are actively working on the specifications are present, and will make any announcements about advances or proof of concepts implementations available to the public. So this is it. If you have any questions, me and Uros are available.
Thank you very much, Davide and Uros, for the presentation. It's of course very detailed, and it's an important work that ARC did. Just I want to mention something. As Davide said, the ARC project, as you know, is finished, but the ARC work will continue, and in fact, everything will move to the ARC community, which we agreed to basically continue and sustain. The ARC website will be also moved to the ARC community website. We have MOU between the JAM project, the OSCAB project, to continue and support joint work. So, and there is sufficient interest among research infrastructures, NRNs, and federation operators to make this work really live beyond the ARC lifetime. This said, if you have questions, you can use the chat, you can talk, it's up to you. And if not, I think you get back to... Yes.
I do have a question.
Oh, yeah. Christoph.
Is there any implementation about all this logic that you know about?
Yes. In GAR, we are working on an implementation which is not ready, and since we already announced it to our community, everything will be available to the public once it will be ready. Unfortunately, we cannot really release the intermediate, say, or the proof of concept implementation. Is based, as you have seen, on co-manage, and for now it is based on Satosa, but we did find some showstoppers actually in Satosa, to tell the truth, and basically on the SP side, and the fact that it is not very easy to actually evaluate the entity categories supported by the IDP in the SP side of Satosa. And this happens to be true also for other service providers, not just for the Satosa SP backend. For example, the Shibboleth SP as well, and the Simple Sum SP side. So it is a more general problem, which is why we did find these showstoppers, and so it will take some more time.
So Davide, you were one question away because we have actually implemented all this for Satosa. So let's get in touch with me afterwards. We are using it in production. It's not ready yet to be published online, but we are going to make it available at some point very soon. But get in touch with me afterwards. Because exactly I was going towards that point, because this is the pain that we found, and actually took us around 4 months.
Yes,
to develop
because
all these things. Thank you.
Yes, because PySAML is not, okay, you don't have all the metadata available in the SP backend, right? In Satosa.
Actually, we're doing some very clever things there, and let's get in touch afterwards. And I hope that soon, very soon, we also have it published in the blog post how all this goes. It is quite complex, but we have it working. It is a very good state right now.
Thanks a lot, Christos. So I think we can leave saying that we also let all the people that participated to this webinar know about that, maybe through the Appint mailing list. So join if you didn't already.
So thank you very, very much to everybody for joining. Thank you so much to David and Uros for preparing this. I hope you have got a better understanding of the assurance complexity, shall we say, and how we are dealing with that.